Joining me today, Samuel Ramani. He's an associate fellow at RUSI think tanks in London and CEO of Pangea Geopolitical Risk. Good afternoon, Samuel. Good to have you here.
Yeah, good afternoon to you.
Reuters reported recently that President Trump saying he wants to talk to Iran, while the Pentagon say it's prepared for possible action. So how do you interpret this mix of signals of diplomacy and deterrence? And what signals is Washington trying to send Tehran right now?
Well, basically, I think that Trump is trying to create a degree of unpredictability. So the Iranian regime really does not know what the next steps are going to be. I think we've already seen the situation where during the early stages of the protests, ahead of the January 8th and January 9 massacres, where Trump basically warned that any kind of Iranian regime repression against civilians would lead to a military response. But then the United States didn't follow up. I think it was in part because there were divisions within the administration about what the next course should be. I think between Marco Rubio on the one side and also between who's more hawkish and also people like C. Witkoff and Jared Kushner who are more dovish on this issue, as well as the risks associated with what comes next and the reluctance of some regional actors, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to kind of go along with this intervention. But now I think a lot of those issues have been ironed out. The Americans are using naval power. The administration does seem to be convinced that there needs to be something done given the scale of the atrocities the Iranians have perpetrated. And now I think that Iran is going to face significant military strikes. So the guessing game and the wait and see game is over. And now I think it's time for action.
Yeah, so do you think that Iran will reply by direct retaliation, by proxy escalation, or calibrated restraint? And what would make each pathway more likely? And what would happen? Or the regime will fall?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to actually trigger a fall of the regime outright through selective military strikes. I think that you may be able to derail the IRGC coercive apparatus, which would weaken their operations in Iraq, weaken their ability to support the Houthis in Yemen, their ability to support Hezbollah in Lebanon, or cause instability on Syria's coast. But they won't be able to completely derail the fabric of local level secret police, the Basij, and other paramilitaries that are carrying out repression against demonstrators. So I think that it could rein in Iran as a destabilizing regional force, but probably not be sufficient enough by itself to trigger the collapse of the regime through pure military strikes. That being said, a lot of damage can be done to the ballistic missile program, to the proxy networks, and to the nuclear program, most of all. And the Russian evacuation that we're seeing in part from Bushehr, the key nuclear facility, is suggestive of already clandestine attacks or potential concerns about imminent ones. And that is quite significant. Yeah, I think that in terms of retaliations, Iran has got several options, right? Obviously, the Iranians will try to, or likely try to target American military installations. They may try the Al Udeid base in Qatar like they did last time. They could attempt to go after the Fifth Fleet base in Bahrain, which seems to be a harder target, or Iraqi territory. Or they could cause instability in the Persian Gulf against naval assets, mining the Strait of Hormuz, for example, or trying to do something like that, not short of a closure, but like there are things they can do short of a closure, or proxy attacks to take advantage of the Saudi UAE rift, for example, in Yemen. But I think that none of these things are going to have much of a deterrent effect on either America or Israel.
Yeah, so let's talk about Iraq and the future of the government. The Washington Post reports the coordination framework proceeded with Noor al-Maliki nomination despite US warnings and talk of consequences. What does this tell us about the balance of power inside Iraq and Iran's leverage over the process?
Well, I think that definitely shows that there's a significant amount of leverage coming from Iran. I mean, obviously, it's important to keep in mind that Nouri al-Maliki is not purely an Iranian proxy. I mean, there was a lot of deal making that was done amongst the Iraqi elites, and he has influence over various Shiite factions, and their coordination framework basically put him in. But that deal making was done with Iran as kind of a strong auxiliary, and it will lead to an expansion of Iran's role in governance in Iraq precisely at a time when Iran is weakening regionally. And that would also ensure that the state has less control over the PMF and other militias. And it could also lead to Iraq becoming a potential base, again, for anti-American influence. On the flip side, there will be pushback against him from the Iraqi business community because I think this will be a severe blow to the development road, which is an important initiative that basically is aimed at taking Iraq out of the Iranian sphere and encouraging international investment. And even countries that have had a very fractious relationship, like Kuwait, have been willing to invest in that
If
format.
they,
So this is a
they
big problem. Yeah.
but if they insist on Al-Maliki to stay or to be the prime minister, so Iran is aligning herself with sanctions. I mean, President Trump is very serious about it. So how they can be how the Iranians can face sanctions on Iraq and financial pressure?
Well, I mean, obviously, I mean, sanctions will be imposed against Iranians' elites, which probably have already been imposed for the most part, and also against those in Iraq who are kind of working with the Iranians. So this would lead to cracking some of the financial networks that deal with that fund the popular mobilization forces and things like that. And there are a lot of things that can be done. Not just by Trump unilaterally, but also through multilateral coordination. For
Yeah.
example, we just saw the European Union target the IRGC, but Britain has not targeted the IRGC over here. And that's a big debate that's happening in our parliament now. And we've also got a situation where the key IRGC aligned banks actually have operations still coming through London, being able to connect to financial networks elsewhere in the Gulf, sometimes through Dubai, funneling that into the hands of a proxy group. So I think that Trump can do a lot through sanctions on his own, but we need to get our allies on side too. And that's where countries like Britain and the European Union also come into play.
Well, how do you read the EU designation, the IRGC as a terrorist group? Strategically, what changes will happen? Enforcement power, financial targeting, political messaging, what is, or all above?
Well, it represents a final turning of the page from the European Union being basically at odds with the US maximum pressure strategy after 2018. So the first step in that was obviously the E3, Britain, France, and Germany going along with the end of the JCPOA that happened on October 18th. The second stage was the expansion of sanctions. Including the IRGC sanctions. And that is a direct response to the Iranian regime's repression of protesters. So, I mean, those two things come together. I think that there will be some substantive outcomes that we'll have on it. Obviously, it leads to much tighter asset freezes all across the European Union's territory. So they cannot really play the member states against each other and take advantage of the divisions in terms of policy. This will also severely damage other business elites who are close to the Iranians. So, for example, any oil industry trade, any investments in the construction sector, any investment in the telecommunications sector, a lot of those investments come through IRGC fronts. So
Mhm.
European businesses dealing with them will have problems. IRGC aligned banks will not be able to process inside European Union or use Euroclear. So I mean that's something that's quite significant, and I think it is going to lead almost certainly, given the pressure on Starmer, to Britain also following suit and then completing the Western alliance bloc, cutting off the IRGC.
Mhm. Let's talk about Gaza and the Board of Peace. The White House says the Board of Peace is meant to be open a path to hope and dignity for Gazans. While Reuters notes allies are cautious and the concept scope is still debated. Your approach?
Yeah, well, basically, I think that the Gaza border peace is important for the implementation of the 20-point plan. And obviously, we've seen periodic ceasefire violations that have occurred on a near daily basis since October. We've seen the emergence of some of these criminal gangs that the Palestinians who are close to Hamas claim Israel supports, but the Israelis claim are criminal actors in their own right. So this basically, and the United Nations has not really done anything to be able to support the ceasefire meaningfully and stabilize it by itself. The UN Security Council obviously is very deeply divided, with the Russians and the Chinese having diametrically opposed views on this conflict compared to the United States, and the Europeans falling somewhere in the middle. So this, I think, brings in more international buy-in. It kind of has the potential to correct some of the problems that the United Nations cannot resolve, and it can actually potentially lead
But the
to a more
president,
technocratic Palestinian
but
government. Yeah,
the Board of Peace is acting uh, without the UN. I mean, President Trump is
yeah, without it,
moving.
yeah.
Yeah. So, so what in your mind he will have incredible aid? What is the architecture that Trump is trying to achieve in Gaza?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. So it basically is a new institution that's going to correct the things that the UN can't do. That's why it's kind of a success. I think that also it will lead to and stimulate substantial amounts of reconstruction investments. I
Mm.
think that now I've just been talking to people in the investment community in the MENA region because I'm going there soon, as well as also in the United States and Europe. And there's actual, now with this Board of Peace, there's new discussions about housing, highways, high-rise apartments, rebuilding. I mean, there's an actual energy to the reconstruction process, which wasn't there before, when many people were focusing on the ceasefire violations and not about the rebuilding. I
Mm.
also think that it does have a significant amount of Islamic world buy-in, which I think is also important for the legitimacy of any process, even though there's differences in how the region approaches it. The very fact that you have Turkey and Egypt on the one hand, the Saudis and the Emiratis, despite their current
Yeah.
disagreements, both being there, that's very significant. And I think it will help lead to regional buy-in that keeps the ceasefire more stable. So I think it's a very positive development.
Your answers are leading me to a very important question about the UAE-Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
tension surfacing late 2025 development in Yemen. What's driving the rift most? Security priorities, influence competition, or diverging threats perspectives? And what's the quickest off-ramp?
Well, I think that many people have kind of oversimplified this to being just about Yemen, and also so if they resolve the Yemen issue and the Emiratis were to withdraw and the Saudis were to kind of take over the South, that you have basic stability, or they've kind of oversimplified it as something to be a product of personal clashes between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed, and Mohammed bin Salman, of course, and Mohammed bin Zayed,
Yeah.
right? But those are oversimplistic analyses. This is a deep-seated and deep rooted division that's been happening and festering for some time. I think it dates back to around 2015 or 2016, where number one, the UAE wants to assert its foreign policy independence and to carry out its own vision,
Mm.
whereas they see Saudi Arabia as a hegemonic actor and they don't really accept Saudi hegemony and Saudi dominance over the rest of the Gulf. Also, they have different tolerance levels towards political Islam. The UAE, through backing the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen, was laser focused on Islam almost as much or even more than the Houthis, whereas the Saudis focused on the Houthis and tolerated Islamist groups. And now there's fundamental divisions also about territorial integrity and state order. I mean, the UAE is more willing to pursue an approach of like sometimes you have to make an omelet by cracking eggs, whereas the Saudis
Yeah.
support strong states. And then there's a disagreement over Israel and Gaza,
Mm.
and the Abraham Accords. So given all of these things, I mean, political Islam, Israel, did totally different approaches to power projection, and this general disdain for Saudi hegemony, I think that this rift is going to last. It might de-escalate in the months ahead. It won't spill over to the oil sector, but I think we will still see a lot of low-lying and significant rivalries in places like Sudan, Somalia, and maybe even Syria.
Yeah, let me ask you my final question about UK. Recent coverage shows the UK's one in, one out returns model hasn't kept pace with arrivals, and the government is emphasizing enforcement and disruption of smuggling networks. Why is the channel route so hard to solve politically and operationally?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that obviously this is a relatively new plan. I mean, it was developed in July between Starmer and Macron, and it really only kicked off in September. So then the small boat crisis is something that's been going on for well over a decade. And it was something that the previous conservative government didn't deal appropriately with. Net migration increased, even though they pledged to decrease it. So I think this is a product and a function of the fact that the one in, one out scheme is extremely fresh and hasn't really taken root in terms of significant enforcements. But and they're also falling below the scales for return. But that being said, there's also some political disagreements about this too. I mean, if people have family ties in the UK, the UK immigration status can sometimes be more discretionary, even on long-term settlement, and that means that they don't want to have litigation and suits. So there's sometimes people in the Home Office are willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, and that means that there's asylum cases that go on for a long time and people don't get sent back coldly.
Mhm.
Also, if they're coming from a higher risk country, like a place like Afghanistan, or and now I think increasingly places like Iraq or Iran, they won't want to be seen to be sending kind of people back to places where they would be abused in terms of human rights. So that's another factor. So I think it's a very new system, and also there's kind of a divide between people in the government who want hard immigration enforcement and strong borders and pressure from the right, and a judicial system that's much more tolerant and much more kind of discretionary in terms of how it deals with that. So a softer judicial system and a hardline political class. And that division prevents a coherent response.
Yeah, understood. Thank you so much, Samuel Ramani, for your thoughts and your insightful ideas and analysis. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was great to be on.